to introduce Professor Erin Thomas Dailey, that he mentioned just now that I just promoted him probably, but it's fine. Professor Erin Thomas Dailey is an associate professor of late antique and early medieval history at the University of Leicester. He is currently the principal investigator for an ERC Consolidator grant project, the DOSE project, and that explores the domestic slavery and sexual exploitation in the households of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East from Constantine to circa the 900 AD. He is also the author of two monographs, Radegon, The Trials and Terms of a Merovingian Queen, and Queens, Consorts, Concubines, Gregory of Tours, and Women of the Merovingian Elite. So I'm so happy to welcome Professor Erin Thomas today. And after his talk, we are going to have some Q&A. And after that, we can go all together to the pub and keep discussing his amazing talk. So welcome again. Here is the slide.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks for having me here today. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to talking to everyone about this subject, and it's looks like a nice friendly crowd. So remember in the Q&A how friendly you are. But I'm going to talk about the Lighthouse of Alexandria today. I wanted to pick something that might interest ancient historians and archaeologists, even if this is mostly text-based. And to think about the Library of Alexandria, not just in antiquity, but afterwards, because it's a constant feature on this list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, right? And we think we know this list. We think we know everything on it, or at the very least, we think that we can look it up on the internet and it'll tell us, and of course it will. If you go searching what were the 7 wonders of the ancient world, this is the list that you consistently get. Pyramids of Giza, Hanging Gardens of Babylon, Statue of Zeus at Olympia, Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, Colossus of Rhodes, and then there's our friend, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Now, what I want to try and demonstrate today is that the Lighthouse of Alexandria is a latecomer on this list. In fact, the Lighthouse of Alexandria is not on the ancient lists of the 7 wonders of the world. It's on late antique / early medieval lists, so it sneaks in actually in the early Middle Ages. And the list that we have now is more the product of the early modern period / Renaissance, rediscovering the classical world, but rediscovering it with this stowaway on board, with this Library of Alexandria, which really shouldn't be there, and would have surprised, not shocked, but would have surprised the ancient authors who talk about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So I'll try and explain who puts it on the list, why is it on the list, and what gets bumped off the list in order to make it appear, and then we have these lost wonders. Okay, so this is the kind of schema here that the issue is why is it making the list, and what does that tell us about the relationship between antiquity and late antiquity and then on to the early Middle Ages, right? In other words, we are receiving our ancient inheritance, even something as innocent as the list of the 7 wonders of the world, not directly from the ancient world, but from the medieval world. And sometimes we bump across this and it surprises us. I mean, there's a couple classic examples. One is that our oldest manuscript of Plato is from, I think, the 9th century, Byzantine manuscript. So we think we know Plato from the ancient world. We do. We know him thanks to medieval scribes who are copying him. You could make a similar argument about the oldest Latin, mostly, let's say, complete version of the Bible, which is produced in 8th century Northumbria, of all places, that we have today still surviving. And the Lighthouse of Alexandria on this list of 7 wonders, it's kind of part of that process and that experience. And the list itself, the 7 wonders, it has a history, and that history is important. I'm going to try and show why that's the case today. So just briefly to refamiliarize ourselves with all the items on the list as conceived by us, and when they were constructed and when they were destroyed. I'm kind of showing this for 2 reasons. One is just to refresh our memories about these different sites. The other is to show just how, even in its construction, the Lighthouse of Alexandria is itself a little bit late. It appears in maybe 275 BC, And that's only 50 years before the Colossus of Rhodes is actually destroyed. So there's a very brief window in the ancient world when you actually even have all 7 of these wonders existing at a single time. Of course, there's no reason why they have to all exist to all be on the list. But nonetheless, as soon as you actually could have this set of 7 wonders within a couple generations, you have a problem. Okay, so I could start with different Renaissance / early modern lists, but I thought I'd do just a kind of visual tour to go along with what I've been saying. So 16th century, we start to have visual depictions. This is a series of the 7 wonders of the ancient world by Merton van Heemskerk. I think I've got him on probably the first original selfie also of all time with this beautiful picture of him near the Colosseum. And he actually says the Colosseum is the 8th wonder of the world, which is one of the dynamics and purposes of why this list is around, actually, why the list is created and used and deployed, isn't just to say, it's so interesting we have these 7 sites, they're very wonderful, but actually to say that one site is greater than all the other ones. And the list exists to praise certain sites that people might want to elevate over others. The way you do that in the early modern period is you have an 8th wonder, and we do that still too. We'll have an 8th wonder. In the ancient world, the list is more fluid, and you're more likely to bump one wonder off and then put the one that you think is the best and say this is the 7th and greater than the other ones. They could say 8th wonder also. I'll show one example of that. But it has that dynamic is consistent. Now, Merton here didn't see these wonders for the most part. He did go to Rome. You can see with the pyramids, he thinks that the pyramids look kind of like the so-called Cleopatra's Needle, which he sees there. And you can see the lighthouse he has here as well. But this list, these visual depictions, they become very standard in illustrations of the ancient world and also in architectural study. And I'll just briefly mention Fischer von Erlach, who in the 18th century produces now really lifelike looking images. And it looks like he has a real genuine study of these monuments. He's thinking from an architectural point of view. It's all starting to look very scientific. And the list is acquiring a different quality. And maybe this is the one that we have inherited the most, right? It's this precise understanding of 7 specific ancient sites. What were their dimensions? What was their function? What did they look like at the time? It's not so much the wonder, the fantasy now, but an actual scientific appropriation of the ancient world. That's not the take that the medieval authors will have on this. And I'll explain that, right? So we think we know why there are these 7 sites. And if you read books about the 7 wonders of the ancient world, they'll almost invariably say the same thing in the introduction. I've just given 2 examples here, but it's almost like a mainstay of the genre of modern books on the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The reason why they're on the list is because they're the most impressive, the most architecturally sophisticated, most interesting in terms of their engineering, that their technological merits are the reason why they're on the list. Now, that's not necessarily wrong in that all of these structures had incredible technological merits and they were all very impressive to look at. But in fact, the reason why some of them are on the list, and particularly the Lighthouse of Alexandria, as you'll see, is very different from that. It can involve issues from politics to religion to fantasy. And we need to keep that in mind as well. And I think some of these studies of the 7 wonders of the ancient world kind of take for granted the rationale behind the list. And that rationale sits ill at ease with some of our sources, and particularly the late antique and early medieval sources. So the list in the ancient world, the list is a fluid thing. And some wonders are almost always on a list of 7. The pyramids are very consistent, almost always on a list. If someone says, here are the 7 wonders of the ancient world, you'll see the pyramids on there. I'll show you a schema of the different lists in a minute. But things can change and things can be swapped around. Nonetheless, in the ancient world, the Lighthouse of Alexandria does not appear on these lists, even though there are authors who would talk about the Lighthouse of Alexandria and who would say how wonderful it was, and who might even somewhere else talk about the seven wonders of the ancient world. So it exists in this description of impressive buildings of the ancient world, but it doesn't make it onto the list. I'll talk a little bit about why it doesn't make it onto the list, but mostly you just need to note that. Now, because the list is fixed on this number 7, right? If you want to add something to the list, then you have to bump something off. And we'll look at which wonders are kind of lost because they've been removed. And when the lighthouse sneaks on, then it forever removes one. The number 7 is fixed. The number 7 symbolizes perfection, whether it's in a number system of 10 or 12. It's the only number that doesn't seem to really fit. It can't really be divided or multiplied to create the other numbers. And it has that sense of its perfection. I could talk more about why the number 7, but let's leave it at that for now. One of the shifts that happens when we go from the ancient world to the late antique and early medieval world is a different way of talking about the wonders. Okay, so they go from being described as things that you need to look at, things that are worthy of being seen, to being things that have this spectacular quality to them, or, well, maybe spectacular is the wrong word, but they have almost a magical quality to them, that they're miraculous almost. And I think that that's part of what tracking the list can show us. It can show us that we're seeing subtle changes in the way people think about monumental things, where they come from and what they represent. Okay, so it's not as if ancient authors don't mention the Lighthouse of Alexandria. They do mention the Lighthouse of Alexandria. They just don't include it on a list of 7 wonders. Of these authors, probably Pliny the Elder is the one who says the most. And reading through his work, you just really think, okay, now he's going to say this is one of the 7 wonders of the world. Elsewhere, Pliny does say there are 7 wonders of the world, but he does not include the lighthouse on the list. Okay, so this is our first reference to the list, and actually one that is, of all the ancient lists, kind of the closest to what we would expect. This comes from the 2nd century BC. I've given the whole quote here, but you can see that a few things from this. One, the list is like the list we have on the side. I've rearranged it into the form we usually notice, except that Babylon shows up twice. Not just the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, but also the walls of Babylon. That is something that will be repeated on these lists. Babylon will sometimes take up 2 places. That's where you would expect to see the lighthouse, or we would at least, is that 7th position. And also the list exists here, as I was saying earlier, to show that the Temple of Artemis is actually the greatest of all. And this is the first of many instances where an author is not just trying to, in an antiquarian sense, note really impressive buildings, but to say there's one that deserves particular attention over the other ones. Okay, here's a schema of the ancient authors, right? And I've listed all the sites that we would expect, and also some that show up on the list that we don't have on the list anymore. And you can see here that Antipater has 7, and it doesn't have, actually no one you can see on the end. Nobody has the lighthouse. It's a 0 for that. Sometimes there's the Ecbatana Palace shows up on the list. Sometimes you'll see the Colossus of Rhodes disappears. That's the case with Marshall. Marshall is trying to say that the Colosseum is the greatest wonder of the world. So the Colosseum's on his personal list, so he has to remove some. It's hard to talk about because it's fluid and you can see there's change happening, but there is also consistency throughout. And there you see the pyramids of Giza always on there. These are the patterns that are inherited by late antiquity, and this is where then the mission is, how does the Lighthouse of Alexandria sneak on? Okay, so this is a list of the ancient authors who describe the lighthouse, and the lighthouse is very well represented also in visual representation. It shows up on imperial coinage. It's one in its own right. This is a coin with the Lighthouse of Alexandria on the back of it. I'll show one of those in a moment. But also any representation of any lighthouse looks like the Lighthouse of Alexandria, possibly because they physically were just constructed in the same kind of way, or possibly for stylistic reasons. It shows up in mosaics, it's carved onto tombs, and even here I've got this beaker, which was discovered in Afghanistan and is now in the Kabul Museum, I hope still in the Kabul Museum. And you can see a representation of the lighthouse. I've got better representations to show you, but this one has a particularly good representation of the statue of Zeus on the top of the lighthouse, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so I can't tell the whole full history of the construction of the lighthouse and everything that's great about it. There's been a lot of work done on that. I don't need to just repeat it all, but I do need to just set the scene here, right? And really, the scene kind of starts with Alexander the Great, the founder of the city of Alexandria itself. Alexander did not build the lighthouse, but I have to mention him here for two reasons. One, because I think there is a talk to be given, and this isn't that talk, but there's a talk to be given about how Alexander creates the context in which you can have wonders of the ancient world, and you can think about a world with a number 7 perfection list of 7 wonders. I think there's a reason why that pattern of thought starts to happen after the developments of Alexander's age, but also in particular that Alexander founds the city, names it after himself, and thankfully for us, picked a city that could have really used to have a lighthouse, right? Alexandria is near the Nile Delta. It's along the coast. The coastline of Egypt is quite nondescript. There's not a lot of places you can stop if you're sailing there, and you could use some kind of sign to help you navigate. The place that the Lighthouse of Alexandria was eventually built was on this island just off of the city, which is mentioned by a lot of ancient authors. I've got here a mention in Homer's Odyssey. It's well known. Here's the city of Alexandria itself, and you can see there's the city of Alexandria and this little island. The island is called Pharos. I'll come back to that. Alexandria makes sense to have a port because it's where it's positioned. It doesn't receive as much of the silt that comes out of the Nile as other ports further along. So it makes sense to put a port there. And when it comes to the lighthouse, I can't get into this too much, but there's some question about whether at what point it was intended to be what we would think of as a classic lighthouse guiding ships at night. Because in the 4th century BC, you normally didn't like to sail at night. Eventually, people do sail at night by the stars and are comfortable with that, and the lighthouse has a fire, and you can see it. That's certainly in the Roman period. But the conception of it may have started as a giant thing that you can see from several miles out at sea to highlight Alexandria and to give people a way to come into the city. And that's what I've got here demonstrated in this quote, just the importance of Alexandria, the difficulty of the site, and that the intention of the lighthouse was to be a visual marker. And that's interesting because the whole idea, supposedly, about the 7 wonders of the ancient world is that they were things that had to be seen. So you would think that an ancient construction that was meant to be huge so that it would be seen from very far away would be the natural inclusion on the list. So it might make us rethink a little bit what the criteria was for inclusion all along. Okay, so the lighthouse is constructed on this island. The island is called Pharos. That word Pharos eventually gives us a word for lighthouse in Latin and then in subsequent languages. And we don't know the origin of that word. I mean, we don't know why the island was called that. There is a legend that has come to us that involves Helen of Troy and her husband Menelaus being washed ashore on this island and trying to figure out where they are and asking someone who's there, where are we? And he's trying to tell them that they're on Pharos Island, and they misunderstand and call it Pharos. And that's where the name comes from. And there's a further misunderstanding that leads to the name Proteus. And Proteus is a god of navigation in the sea and is associated with the site. So probably we have a kind of back construction of a legendary story that's entertaining based on an otherwise not understood etymology of the site, and how it was being used in later practices. Okay, you can investigate that further on your own. It's an interesting legend. There's a few others. Alexander picked the site because Homer came to him in a dream, for example, which, I mean, you know, I gave all these reasons why it makes sense to put a city there, and actually, you know, maybe Homer was just showing up in the night. There is, or was, an inscription on the site that explained who built it. So this is the question. We know it's built after Alexander the Great, but when is it built exactly, and who built it exactly? There's quite a bit of debate about that. I've gone with something like 725 BC, having been built not by Alexander's immediate successor, who was Ptolemy Soter, but by the next ruler after that. For our purposes, maybe it's not so important. I guess what I just say is that this inscription is noted in multiple ancient sources, and there's even one medieval Arab source that says that there was an inscription that was still kind of hanging on, like off the side of the building, and you could see it in the 12th century. There are also descriptions of the building. Some of them are from antiquity. Josephus gives a bit of a description. Probably the best description is from that same 12th century medieval Arabic source, which has a really long description of the building. Of course, now you're centuries and centuries later, further into the future. It looks different, but nonetheless, the description is very detailed. There's even one point in the description where the author says, I looked at my notes and this part was smudged. Unfortunately, I didn't use the right ink, so I don't know how tall this section was, but I think it was 2 meters, something like that, and then goes on to talk about the building. So you really get the feeling that you're getting a decently accurate understanding of what it looked like, at least in the 12th century. And you can compare that to Josephus, you can compare that to ancient depictions and try and figure it out. Let's just say it's in 3 stages, and they're of decreasing height. So 100 meters for the first stage, 60 for the next, and 30 for the last. And then on top of it, you have this statue of Zeus the Savior, Zeus Soter, who will rescue sailors who are at sea and be the target that they're looking for when they're trying to find a friendly port. And apparently, at least by the Roman period, there was a fire at the bottom of the lighthouse that mirrors were used to redirect the light so that people could see it. And by that point, it's being used for night navigation. Mirrors probably of polished bronze. Okay, what did it look like? So I mentioned the descriptions, but we also have these visual representations, which are all really interesting. Coins, the Lighthouse of Alexandria shows it numerous times on coins. Mostly looks the same. This 3-tiered structure. There's also a coin of the lighthouse in Ostia, which shows smoke coming out of it. So you feel like that gives reasonable belief in this idea of a fire being used to produce the light from down within. There's a couple surviving buildings that look kind of like maybe the Lighthouse of Alexandria used to look. One is a funerary monument, never had any lighthouse functions. It's also in Egypt, though, and it seems to be modeled after the Lighthouse of Alexandria. And then we have just all the other lighthouses which follow this pattern, and I've picked one here, which is a Roman lighthouse that survives in Dover, actually, next to a church. And then lastly, this mosaic, which is really cool. So this mosaic is depicting the arrival of St. Mark into Alexandria, and it's in the cathedral in Venice, but it gives a depiction of the lighthouse, and it's from the later medieval period when it actually has a mosque sitting on top of it. And several of the Arabic sources talk about there being a mosque on top. Ibn Tulun. Ibn Battuta is the last one. He's 14th century. He says that he went to the lighthouse twice. The first time he went in about 320, and it was in not great shape, but it was okay. He walked around it. He says he went back 20 years later. It was pretty much in ruins by that point. Okay, let's get to the medieval part of it. Now, I've got the same list as before, all the ancient authors and what they say. And then I have some of the late antique and early medieval authors. And there's two in here I'm going to talk about in particular. I'm going to talk about this inscription, which you find in Constantinople. And I'm going to talk about Gregory of Tours and what he says, because those are the first two authors here who actually put the Lighthouse of Alexandria on the list. Okay, so the first time the Lighthouse of Alexandria is described as one of the seven wonders of the world is about the year 500. And it's in that 6th century when it's first showing up on the list. It's very surprising. Right? You can see that the list starts to get even more fluid, and there are a lot of other things that are added to it. I'll talk about some of these things. Maybe what's more interesting is how consistent certain parts of the list are. Those pyramids, they really stay on there until Gregory of Tours doesn't have them anymore. Also, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus is mentioned a lot and survived for a very long time as well. I'll come back to this list. Okay, so the two sites I want to talk about, the two sources I want to talk about for the lighthouse entry coming onto the list, and then like, why does that happen? That's the big question here. One is the Calca, right? What is the Calca? Calca is a giant triumphal entryway, or basically like a gate that was in Constantinople, right next to the imperial palace. And I've got a map here, which you can see. Hopefully you can see on the map. I don't have my pointer with me, but it's just at the conjunction of roads, right where the great palace meets the baths and the Augustaion. You have this grand monument sitting in Constantinople. And on that monument, you have an inscription, which we're lucky has survived. It was recorded in an collection, an antiquarian collection. And so we have it. But it was originally carved on this monument, and according to the inscription, it was put there under Anastasius I after 497 at some point, but before 518. So we can say, let's say 500 or 510, something like that. It was destroyed along with a lot of the city in the Nika riots, and then rebuilt by Justinian, and presumably he took this same inscription and put it back up. But there is some doubt about that process, because we really don't have a well-documented understanding of what was happening. The Calca is described in extreme detail by Procopius, who writes this interesting book on buildings, but he doesn't mention the inscription. So we have to go to this now anthology, Greek anthology, that contains all these inscriptions. Okay, and I give the quotation here. Now, there's so many surprising things about this, right? One is it's significantly different from all the lists we have in antiquity. There are some familiar sites. The pyramids are there. The Colossus is there. And then shows up now the newcomer, the lighthouse. But some other sites maybe we're not used to. So the question is, why all the changes, and what is the purpose of this text, right? Well, the text is clearly attempting to glorify not only Constantinople, but the reign of the Byzantine emperor, where it is on the arch and on the gate. And it's probably not an accident that the sites that are mentioned here, broadly speaking, are within the Byzantine Empire at the time. So there's a desire to not just update the list of seven wonders, but update the ancient world now and to show continuity there. But also, I think in a more kind of mundane, well, not mundane, but in a simpler way, the author wants to show that this gate is huge and monumental and splendid. So the first monuments are shiny, glorious things with bronze, and then the next ones are very vast, and then the last ones are very tall, right? So you've got the pyramids are very tall, the Colossus, which had long since been just had fallen down, was also very tall, and now the lighthouse shows up. So could it be that the Lighthouse of Alexandria appears on our list of the seven wonders of the world because the person behind this inscription needed a really tall building to compare this monumental gate to? I mean, the idea was it's supposed to be so impressive to see that you have to include it on the list, right? Which is slightly different than that rationale. Okay, slight digression here, but there's a really good article on the mausoleum of Theodoric the Great, and how that mausoleum is modeled possibly on the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. I don't need to go into that because one, this is about the Lighthouse of Alexandria, and two, the article's already done, okay? But the key thing is this is happening at pretty much the same time. So this mausoleum is constructed maybe 510s, maybe 520s. And if we accept the argument that it is an attempt, it's very unusual design. It's hard to find contemporary parallels for it. You can possibly, there are some other suggestions. But if we accept that this is an attempt to reproduce one of the known wonders of the ancient world at this time, we can see how now we can say late antique or early medieval society. I mean, Theodoric is a Gothic king ruling over Italy. We can see how there's this engagement with the list of 7 wonders, which I think is worth keeping in mind for us. Okay, Gregory of Tours. So the inscription, you know, its context is hard to work out. Its purpose is a bit vague. Obviously, we don't know who wrote it, and there's not a lot of context for that. Different story with Gregory of Tours. He wrote many, many things. We have a good idea about what Gregory thought, what he was up to, and why. He was a bishop of Tours in the late 6th century, and he produces a text that is the last place you would expect to find a list of the 7 wonders of the world. He produces a text that is a technical manual on how to calculate monastic hours at night by looking at the stars. So you can figure out when you need to pray by understanding the movement of the stars. And then he sneaks in there certain things like a comet happened in this year and it meant a certain king would die and that kind of thing, just to make it interesting maybe, right? He includes that kind of thing in his other works, his historical works as well, and in his collection of miracles. He's interested in this a lot, but it's a technical manual on the motion of the heavens. Before that, he puts on it a list of 7 ancient wonders of the world, and then, by way of comparison, 7 of God's wonders. So he has 14 wonders. And the 7 wonders of God, I'll show them in a minute, they're not constructions, but they're sort of natural phenomena that are enduringly miraculous, and you can go there and see the enduring miraculous powers of these wonders, or you can hear about them at least. Some of them you can't see, like the Phoenix, I'll show in a minute. So Gregory does something that is, in some sense, radically new and very much the kind of thing that a medieval bishop would do, but also is understanding the classical effort in that he's comparing some wonders with other wonders and saying these are the greatest. It's just that he's comparing all of the man-made wonders with all of the divine ones and makes the divine the greatest. Okay, but he still puts the Lighthouse of Alexandria on there. So why? And it's probably not because, I mean, he had not been to Constantinople and he probably hadn't heard about the inscription in the Chalca. I don't think that's his source of information. I'm not even entirely sure what he read that gave him the idea of there being 7 wonders of the ancient world, although he clearly had a text that was influential for him. It may have been from Cassiodorus. I'll talk about Cassiodorus in a minute. Okay, so Gregory includes some of the things on the ancient list that you find. He includes the Colossus of Rhodes. He probably didn't know much about it. His description of it is vague. He probably doesn't necessarily understand that it was a kind of gigantic idol. He includes the city of Babylon with its walls. So he's not talking about hanging gardens, but he's not the first person to talk about the walls by any stretch of the imagination. He's probably got the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. He just says it's a tomb of a Persian king, so let's give him that one. But he removes the Temple of Artemis, the one that on the original list of 7 wonders was the whole point for having the list, right? Because that was for Antipater, that was the biggest temple and the most impressive thing. Well, Gregory cuts it off. And he gets rid of the statue of Zeus. Curiously, he gets rid of the pyramids. Very rare, unusual for him to get rid of the pyramids. I think he's the first author to take the pyramids off. He knows about the pyramids. I'll talk about the pyramids in a minute. The earlier list by Cassiodorus, which I'll show you, had not made these changes. So Cassiodorus is himself a scholar and a churchman working before Gregory, or roughly sort of elder contemporary. So Gregory's finding something's objectionable, and we need to try and understand exactly why. But also Gregory's adding things. So he adds two straightforwardly biblical examples of things. He adds Noah's Ark, and he adds the Temple of Solomon. He does not add those as God's wonders. Those are man-made wonders. All of the divine wonders are not, they're not buildings or constructions, even though both Noah's Ark and the Temple of Solomon are laid out exactly how they should be built by divine instruction in biblical books. So the blueprints are handed over by God, but they're listed here as man's wonders. And then the lighthouse, right? Why not another biblical wonder or something like that? I mean, I think Gregory's intervention is probably more influential than the earlier example. So understanding why he put the lighthouse on the list is probably understanding why it's on there, even if he wasn't the first one. And you can see here, I've got now all of them again, just to refresh. You've got Cassiodorus's list, then Gregory's list. Cassiodorus, no lighthouse, very classical in interpretation. Gregory's different, a lot of new things being added here. He also adds, I forgot to mention, the theater at Heraclea, which is an unknown site, unknown object. I'll talk about that in a moment. And you can see how Gregory's being influential because you have this 8th century text, which is an anonymous treatise on the 7 wonders of the world, but falsely attributed to Bede, which picks up this non-existent theater of Heraclea. So clearly Gregory, and the lighthouse, right? So clearly Gregory is being influential here in redefining the list. All right, here's Gregory's man-made wonders and divine wonders. And you can see the divine wonders are mostly natural operation of the world or special miracles that nonetheless reoccur all the time. But he's even got things like the illumination of the sun on there, and then his man-made wonders. Why did Gregory cut some of the things off the list? I think if we look at another Gregory, we can get the answer. Gregory Nazianzus, Bishop of Constantinople, 4th century. He gives a list of wonders and he removes obviously pagan wonders like the statue of Zeus, right? And the temple of Diana. So he takes out sites of pagan worship and removes them from the list. I think his instincts are similar to Gregory's instincts later. What does he add to the list? He just says 2 cities named Thebes in Greece and Egypt. Why didn't Gregory Nazianzus add great biblical examples? Because actually the whole point of his list was to say that the 7 wonders were human constructions. They were overshadowed by the charity of Basil of Caesarea. So he didn't want to say that Noah's Ark was overshadowed by Basil of Caesarea's charity. In fact, Gregory Nazianzus here is pretty much saying Basil of Caesarea is the 8th wonder of the world. So back to Gregory of Tours now. Gregory of Tours is uncomfortable with pagan sites being on the list. Off they go. Okay, I mean sites specifically of pagan worship, and he adds the biblical ones. Now, what about this theater at Heraclea? Well, Gregory's from Clermont, and in the church in Clermont, there's this kind of marble that Gregory talks about being Heraclean marble and makes a big deal out of it. And my guess is he thinks this marble came from this theater, and it's a local site for him. Okay. But we care about the lighthouse, so let's talk about the lighthouse. The lighthouse is the last man-made wonder, and Gregory is explicit that ships who are led astray at night are able to be guided by the lighthouse, even when it's dark, and even when there's a storm, and they can't see the stars, they can see this amazing light, and they know what direction to sail in, right? So he goes in for this stars metaphor and sailing metaphor. Gregory likes this sailing metaphor. He also uses it when it comes to the Noah's Ark. He considers Noah's Ark a metaphor for the church, which is sailing at night and the believers are inside and it's guiding people. So there's a symmetry between the lighthouse, which is the last man-made wonder, and the Noah's Ark, which is the first man-made wonder. And then he's about to discuss his treatise on how to calculate the monastic hours from looking at the stars. So the people who are looking at this manual are kind of like the sailors in the sea who are looking at the lighthouse. They're going to look at how you calculate time based on the stars. And it's basically a thematic inclusion because it works as a metaphor for his offices of the church. Okay, so that may seem very straightforward, but think about that, right? Why is the Lighthouse of Alexandria on our lists of the wonders of the ancient world? It's on our list because a early medieval bishop wanted to use a metaphor for the monastic hours and the church and thought the Lighthouse of Alexandria was a great way to do it. And because there was a monumental gate in Constantinople that needed to be taller than very tall buildings at the time. Those are late antique / medieval reasons. They're not ancient reasons, and they're not in keeping with the normal rationale that's used to explain why there's this list of 7 wonders in the ancient world. So the idea is, I hope, this little explanation in why the Lighthouse of Alexandria snuck on the list is because the Middle Ages gave us our ancient inheritance. And when they did it, they mostly did it, but they snuck on a few of their own concerns as well. And that process can surprise us, but that process is important. Okay, that's it.
Being heard by the people online. So I've just made this work. So you can sorry.
Thank you very much. So 2 observations. Thank you for that, Erin. That was great. A couple of observations. Firstly, I wonder about the degree to which this is a canonical 7. I mean, I say the point about the numerological significance of the number 7 and so on, but a lot of your examples seem to be people talking about a bunch of wonders, which might be 7, rather than the definitive 7 wonders of the world. So that's the first thought. And the second one is about the kind of formulation of the question, which you've got as, why did the lighthouse make it on the list? From the tables that you had, I was kind of wondering why the walls of Babylon dropped off. That they seem to be pretty canonical once they get established, if there is a canon. And then suddenly they disappear and they're not included anymore. And is it just because the Hanging Gardens sound quite cool and then we've already got Babylon? Does that make sense as a question?
It does, yeah. So I mean, I think it would be really worth like looking at every aspect of the list and why some things are going and other ones are not. I think Babylon gets confusing for people because some people say the walls, some people say the gardens, some people say the walls and the gardens, and some just say Babylon. So I'm not entirely sure why the process that goes behind the walls being removed, but I think it's getting kind of lost in the mix of what is it about Babylon that's important, and should Babylon have 2 sites on the list? Or is it enough to just have Babylon once, or then maybe sometimes they have it 0 times? But I don't know exactly, so I think that's worth a bit of a deep dive to try and understand like what happens to the walls of Babylon. Is there something about Babylon that's significant? I mean, well, there is obviously, but which significance is mattering to people? And then like methodologically, okay, is it right to distinguish lists of 7 from just discussions of really wondrous things? And I think there's probably a methodological issue there, and maybe I'm pushing too hard by saying, let's just treat the list of 7 totally separately from people talking about interesting, wondrous things. But there does seem to be a kind of genre process here where people will say, I'm going to rattle off 7 wonderful things, and this other thing is greater than them, or something like that. So I feel like there's maybe within the broader tradition of ancient people talking about wondrous things, where they do sometimes say the lighthouse is really interesting. There's a subgenre where they want to pick the perfect 7. Yeah.
I take the point. In some sense, my question would be about the type of pub conversation in which this would happen in the ancient world. Would it be a pub quiz, name the 7 wonders of the ancient world, or would it be a Why do you think the seven wonders of the ancient world? And I wonder if it's more the latter that becomes the former, if that makes sense, to get into the modern period, especially.
Yeah, that may well be true. I think for the medieval period, they're probably more obsessed with the number seven than anybody else because they're thinking numerologically and like for Gregory, he has seven man-made wonders and seven divine wonders, and seven is meaning something a lot for him there. So maybe part of the inheritance and that emphasis on seven is that the pub conversation changes when it's being done by these clerics, and they're going to take a number more seriously. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think qualifies as one of these seven wonders, and if there is no established criteria, whether we need to revise which of these wonders are on the list.
Yeah, I mean, we can make new lists ourselves, I guess. I mean, it's hard to distill exactly what the criteria was at any given point. I think it's a lot of it's defined by the individual text and what they're trying to achieve, rather than having a standard of they need to be things so one idea is that they're sites you could actually go and see, like as a tourist, almost an ancient tourist or something. Or that they were things that if you saw them, you had to think they were one of the wonders of the world. So they're very big, impressive things that you've beheld. I didn't talk about it, but when Gregory talks about some of the items, he gives a description. They're kind of almost magical. I mean, like the Lighthouse of Alexandria is upheld by seven crabs, for example. A lot of strange things. So then they become more miraculous. So what criteria were people using? I mean, that's I guess one of the takeaways is that there isn't one ubiquitous set of criteria that people are applying consistently, but we've maybe assumed that there is because we've assumed that the nature of the buildings force them to be on the list. Yeah. I don't know if I hope that answers the question, but by all means, we can come up with our own new list if we if we want to.
Thanks. Yeah, that was great. And having sat in the pub with Andy many times, that's exactly the sort of pub conversation he would want to kick off. It's, what do you think the seven wonders of the world are? My question was about destruction, though, and about the process of a lot of these sites having been destroyed, and often having been destroyed before the people are writing about them, and what that does to the kind of memory of these sites. Like the pyramids are obviously still there, the lighthouse is still there for quite a lot of the people you were talking about, but a lot of the others are gone long before and haven't been seen, and kind of surviving in these other kinds of realms, whether it's in texts or it's in oral histories or it's in other kinds of things. And to what extent does the process of destroying them kind of elevate them? I mean, there are other sites that aren't on your list, like the Parthenon or whatever, that presumably could be one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, which survive to this day. And then these ones that have been destroyed, and how that relationship between destruction and memory and elevation, is there a kind of connection there in some of these sites that's playing out in how they're being talked about and thought about as wonders of the world?
Yeah, the destruction is interesting. Sometimes it's hard. It's not always obvious when some of them are destroyed exactly. I think some of the sites of pagan worship fell afoul of Christianization of society, really, and they were actively destroyed or purged of their polluting content. The Colossus of Rhodes pretty much fell over really quickly, but then was just laying there, and no one could manage to put it back up, which has an interesting quality to it. Is it a critique to keep mentioning this wonder that isn't just gone, but we can see that we lack the capacity to restore a world that's now lost. And I don't know how long it was witnessable as a destroyed monument. The pyramids are always still there, but their meaning changes. And elsewhere in Gregory's works, he says that they're the granaries that Joseph used during the biblical famine. So they were, in a sense, an enduring Christian site in a weird way. So there's a whole afterlife to each of the wonders that then influences whether they're on the list or not, and what it means to have them on there. And I feel maybe like the destroyed aspect of it might mean more post-Christianization, where you have this idea that nothing lasts forever and all of man's efforts will eventually be destroyed. And the only things that endure are the divine wonders. So I think that might be part of the late legacy of it all.
Cool, thank you. Just building off of both of that, and actually the pub sort of list. Was there any evidence of actually creating a list for a specific audience where they would know more of these monuments? I'm thinking about like the Lighthouse itself, and Gregory tours like the Synod of Alexandria and all the councils going on there that might have a little bit more relevance than something else where a lot of the Western Europeans may not know. Would it be like maybe, and even the other ones that were sort of like trying to prop up another monument, could those have been known to kind of like for an audience rather than actually trying to make the list, but be a list?
I mean, the Lighthouse is one that was pretty well known because it is used on so many coins that are issued in the, especially in the Roman period. People have it in their pocket. So they had to know about that one. But yeah, I mean, the popularity of the monument given a particular audience certainly explains, I think, some of the what the content on the inscription in the Calcha is going to be about a different audience and a different idea of what the world is actually. That goes hand in hand. And I mean, every text is written not just by the author, but by the audience too. So we always have to think, what's the audience expecting? What do they want to hear? And yeah, maybe there were some authors who might have liked to leave something off and couldn't have left it off because their audience wouldn't have accepted it, or they included something begrudgingly because their audience demanded it was on there or something. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have heard that the Colossus of Rhodes and the Hanging Gardens are of dubious historicity. So what's the general academic opinion on if they existed or not? And also, what do you personally think?
Yeah, I skipped over the Hanging Gardens being an issue because it's not entirely clear that there was Hanging Gardens specifically in Babylon. And I don't have an opinion about that. I think there was a Hanging Gardens, and it probably was in Babylon, but it might have been somewhere else. But I think the Colossus is more interesting because that one, what happened is that you have depictions of the Colossus, which are largely influenced, well, kind of by Shakespeare, but they predate him, where the Colossus is standing astride a harbor. So one leg's on one side, one leg's on the other. You sail underneath. Who knows what view you get when you look up? And it's this great thing. And there's really no way that a construction like that could have been made in antiquity with it standing up. So the general opinion is it couldn't have looked like that, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't have been a big statue. We probably just have to rethink how it would have been. Yeah. But I think the Colossus is that. I think that one's solidly attested. I'm confident in that one. The Hanging Gardens are more fantastical in nature, but there was this, I can't explain that, but there was a kind of elevated irrigation system using screws that was developed in basically ancient Persia that you could use to bring water up to a Hanging Gardens. And we know that system existed and worked. We just don't know exactly where the garden was.
Regarding the Colossus, it was not revealed because an oracle forbade that. It lay there damaged for almost 900 years. And that's the end of the comment. So I would like to give you another round of applause.